Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of The Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about documenting the enslaved in our family histories. Now this presentation is a little bit sensitive and it is directed mainly at my white friends and colleagues and those of you who are looking into your slaveholder ancestors. For those of you who are people of color, I have consulted with several of my colleagues who are also blacks and descendants of those who are formerly enslaved. And I have tried to be as sensitive as possible about this subject, but the truth of the matter is I'm white. And so hopefully I'm not offensive to anybody. I do want to start this with a bit of a story, and I hope that this story is taken in the correct spirit in which I share it. But it's a story that helps you understand how I discovered one of the slaveholders in my own family tree and some of my feelings about him and about the circumstances surrounding his life. And then I will get to some tips about how I am documenting those that he enslaved and trying to connect with the descendants of those individuals. So if you want to skip the story, you can skip to the end for those tips. But let me just share with you the story about my 6 times great-grandmother, Margaret Lawrence. So this is my Granny Lawrence. It's my mom's grandmother. And if you go back on her Lawrence line, all the way back here, you will find a woman named Margaret Lawrence. She was born in 1709 in England. She was a bit of a rebellious teenager. She left her parents' faith, and because of that, she was kicked out of her home at a very young age and had to fend for herself, ended up getting herself into some trouble, ended up in Old Bailey prison in London, and then her sentence was that she was going to be shipped off to America on a prison ship. When she got to America, she was purchased for an indentureship by a man named Tobias Phillips, who was 22 years her senior. He was married with a family. He was from Richmond, Virginia, and he owns a large piece of property in Richmond, Virginia. Now, he set her up on his property, and within just a couple of years, she had a couple of children. And the rumor, of course, in the family has always been that even though her 2 children bear the Lawrence name, that Tobias Phillips was in fact their father, that this was a non-consensual relationship whereby he fathered children with this indentured servant woman that he essentially owned for that period of time. Now, my Margaret Lawrence is a white woman from England, and she was not a slave. She was an indentured servant. And the difference between that is that she had hope of her indentureship ending. Her indentureship was for a period of time, and when that indentureship was over, she was then free to go. Now, the circumstances of the time might not have made that an easy endeavor, but there was that hope at least. And her 2 children, they were both boys, were born into these circumstances, and unfortunately she died while they were still very young. Again, the family story is that she was pregnant with another child and died in childbirth or as a result of complications of that pregnancy. And so her 2 children now are left with this man who is their father, but who does not acknowledge them as their father. One of the things we discover about Tobias Phillips very shortly after this, because he actually dies a year later, is that he makes her children fulfill the contract of her indentureship. So they have to stay as his servants until they come of age. And we learn that in his will and through some of his estate papers. Now, I was looking into those estate papers because specifically I was trying to prove whether or not these 2 boys were in fact the children of Tobias Phillips. And what I discovered is while he makes some statements or provides some information about them fulfilling their mother's indentureship and remaining as servants to him and to those who inherit his estate until they come of age, that he never calls them his sons. He always refers to them with the last name of Lawrence. They continued with the last name of Lawrence for the remainder of their lives. So there was still this little bit of hesitation or question about whether or not he actually was their father. Of course, that was the story, but we didn't have any solid proof at that point. But what I did discover in the process of all of that research was his will. And in his will, he very specifically lists some black slaves. Now, I knew this was a possibility. I fully expected it. My mother's family is all Southern, deep Southern roots, all the way back to colonial times. I was actually more surprised that I hadn't come across it sooner or earlier in her family tree. And so here I was faced with it. Now I've got the notes here on my screen, so you can kind of see what I've done is I've taken that will, or that probate, actually it's not just the will, there's a whole probate file, and I've transcribed it so that I have it available here in my notes so that I can refer to it without having to go try and reread that original image over and over. And so as I'm transcribing this will, there are some things that come out about this man's personality in his probate records. And one of them is that he was a very controlling and likely a very cruel man for a lot of different reasons. So one of those reasons, and I'm just going to read it and try not to get emotional about it, is this first item in his will where he says, I give to my son George Phillips, Negro Bowain, and the use of my Negro wench Fortimer until she shall be delivered of 3 children. Her firstborn I give to my daughter Elizabeth, her second to William Dale the younger, the third to my daughter Hannah, and then the property to vest my son George. Now, if I've understood that correctly, he has 2 Negro slaves, Bowain and Fortimer. And Fortimer is to be bred, likely with George, until she delivers 3 children. And then this man has decided that even long after his death, he will continue to make provisions about where the children of that Negro slave are sent as property to be inherited by his other children. I remember the first time I saw this just being, it didn't surprise me he had slaves. It surprised me the callous nature in which he referred to them. And from that time forward, I have had this desire to find Fortimer. Now, I haven't been horribly successful yet. I have made progress, and I am discovering some clues. But here is, kind of to put this in some perspective, one of the problems that we deal with as we try to document the lives of the enslaved. Our black cousins, many of them who are actually our cousins because of these former slaveholders, have the ability, just like any of us, to trace their family history from 2017, from today, back to 1870. And then they hit what we call the 1870 wall. We've defined 1870 because emancipation was issued immediately following the Civil War in the 1860s. So 1870 is the first U.S. federal census where those who were formerly enslaved are listed on the federal census as free individuals. They're listed in households with their full names and their ages and their genders and their birthplaces. So we've got more complete information, or the same information that has been available to that point for white families for 2 decades. 1850 is the first census in which white families, every household was listed, or those who were free blacks or other people of color who were free. So 1850 and 1860 censuses list the names of everyone who was free, and then 1870 lists the name of everyone who was free, but that is the first census following emancipation. Now, in 1850 and 1860, there is a supplement to the census, which is called the slave schedules, where essentially it lists the name of the slaveholder, and then it will list the genders and the ages of those he enslaves. So no names, no other personally identifying information, usually just the age and the gender listed under the name of the slaveholder. So this 1870 wall is for those who were formerly enslaved, or descend from those who were formerly enslaved, is a really solid brick wall. It's a very difficult thing. One of the other challenges has to do with names. There are a lot of myths. There are a lot of ways in which people who were formerly enslaved took names, and there are a lot of instances in which they changed those names. So typically, and this is not in every case, but typically those who were enslaved were given a given name, and most of them, or many of them, did not have a surname until after emancipation. Now, some did. There are obviously exceptions to that rule for various reasons, but most did not have a surname until after emancipation. So that becomes one of the difficulties for our Black cousins in tracing prior to 1870, is you have one less significant piece of personally identifying information to allow you to find your ancestors. Number two, as it relates to names, many times those names were changed. So immediately following emancipation, depending on their circumstances, they may have been given a surname, they may have taken a surname, and in ensuing years, they may have changed that surname, all for varying reasons. Now, some of the patterns that we see, again, there are exceptions, but some of the patterns that we see, a name might be given of the last slaveholder. So now there is a group of people who may or may not be genetically related to one another, who all have the same last name because that is the name of their last slaveholder. Now, a year or two down the road, as after emancipation, as they start to exercise some of their freedoms, some of them may make a decision that they no longer want to bear the name of that last slaveholder. Some of them choose a name of a previous slaveholder. Maybe it was the first slaveholder in their family. Maybe it was their first slaveholder. Maybe it is a prominent person in their community where they're now living. Maybe it is, in some cases, I did a research project for an African-American family where they had identified who the oldest Black man in their community was. He was a slave who had been brought from Africa, and so he was revered in their community. And so many of them took his given name, Amos, as their surname. And so now you have this entire community with 20 or 30 families who have the last name of Amos, and some of them are related and some of them are not related. And for years, a lot of people were looking in this community for a slaveholder with the last name of Amos. And it turns out that it was not a slaveholder name. It was actually the given name of the oldest Black gentleman in their community who had come from Africa or been forcibly brought over from Africa. So a lot of different ways in which individuals following emancipation end up with their names. And so one of the things that is key to keep in mind, if you are going to try to trace the descendants of the slaves that you discover in your family history research, is to recognize that names are not always the personally identifiable information that they are with traditional European-based research. And so you have to start to think about other ways in which to identify individuals. And that's a good exercise because, people are about, names are important, names are significant, but they are not the only piece of identifying information. One of the other challenges that we have on both sides of this equation is that we are looking at a history of 250 years of slavery, where the records might be great records, but you still have to tie all of the pieces together before you get past that 1870 wall to be able to connect with people who might be living today who are descendants of that individual. And so that's been my challenge here with Tobias Phillips. Tobias Phillips died in 1740. That's 130 years before emancipation. So as I have begun to trace now George Phillips and Fortimer and that family to see if I can figure out what happens to them. I'm working piece by piece through some of these records, many in my case which are not online, so I'm going to need to go to the archives in Richmond, Virginia, to look through some of these records to make some of these connections, to continue to trace Fortimer's family one generation at a time. The other problem, of course, is, and this is something we have to be super sensitive to, is that these families are not kept together. They are forcibly separated. So again, in traditional European research, one of the identifiable pieces of information we often have is that families move together in clusters. They buy and sell land with each other. There are a lot of ways in which we can uncover them. In some of these families of slaves, what we're discovering is, like in this case, Fortimer's children were given away to the siblings of George. And so now we have to trace those families to see what happens to each of these branches of Fortimer's family. So it's difficult, but in my mind, I think it is so significant. And here's why. And I've struggled with how to say this because there's a phrase that I'm really sensitive to, and that is I don't want to come across as a white savior. I don't want to come across as I have the answers, because I don't. What I have is a great desire to connect people with their family history. And that desire extends to everyone. But particularly for my African-American cousins, and they are cousins, and some of them we've genetically proven were cousins, and they're stuck with me now. I have this desire to help because I have the records in many cases. I have some of those connections, some of those threads, and I want to be able to extend those threads enough that they can pick up those threads and continue on with them themselves. I just feel that that's so important. And so let me just share with you then some of the ways I've kind of seeded it through this story of Tobias and Maggie and George and Fortimer. But I want to just make sure we get through a bulleted list of some of the records that you can use to do this research, and then some of the ways in my tree that I've chosen and some other places where I've chosen to document this information. So let's start with records that you can use to discover those who are enslaved. One of the things you'll need to look at to start is the 1850 and 1860 census records. Just because your ancestor was poor does not mean they were not a slaveholder. And I think sometimes we feel like we're safe because they weren't. Make note of those property values on the 1850 and 1860 census records. If there is any property value at all, it could be that that property is a slave or a couple of slaves. And so you might need to go digging into property records at that point. Now, the 1850 and 1860 census records, as I said, there's also a slave schedule that you can look up by the name of your white ancestor to see if they had slaves as property. Those are the most recent records. Those are going to be the easiest ones to work with. Again, it's going to be the easiest to jump that 1870 wall and connect with individuals in the 1870 census where you can pass that information along. Prior to that, you're going to need to use almost exclusively property records and probate records. Now, probate records are the richest source of information about property, about relationships, and about inheritance. As you can see from that will of Tobias Phillips, he gave very explicit instructions about what was to happen to those that he enslaved, who they were to be inherited by, and in some cases, how they were to be used. And that, as horrific as it is information that is invaluable to helping us connect these families. Probate records are not just wills. So in the case of Tobias Phillips, I have his will, but I also have the letters of administration, the letters of guardianship for his children, so I can start to build this idea of this community around him. Who were his associates? Who were his business associates? Who were the people he trusted and worked with? What was the structure of his family? And how did that interact with the families of those that he enslaved, or the families of those that he indentured in the case of Maggie and her two sons? And so we start to develop this picture of him and of his property. There were also inventories, and the inventory clarified for me that the 2 slaves that he names in the will are the only 2 slaves that he had. So just because somebody doesn't name a slave doesn't mean they don't have slaves. So that inventory in the probate file becomes really important as well. The times that I have noticed where slaves have been named in the will is usually because there is some instructions, specific instructions about which slaves are to be inherited by which family members. In some cases, there will just be a general, all of my property inheritance given to a spouse or to an oldest son without documenting the details. And so that inventory is almost as important, and in some cases more important than the actual will. So all of that is part of those probate files. And searching those, Ancestry has, I think, 1.7 million probate files available online. Only the name of the primary individual has been indexed. And so, again, one of the challenges for our cousins who are people of color is the names of the slaves, the names of the children, the names of the witnesses, whatever, like none of that has been indexed. The only thing that is searchable in those probate records is the name of the primary individual. And so as we make those discoveries, as we find those records, making sure that we document the names and maybe even attach that probate record to not just the person whose probate file it is, but also to the other individuals named in the will or in those property inventories is really important. Another really powerful tool for connecting us with our cousins who are people of color is Ancestry DNA. So some of you may have heard the story several years ago. There's a genealogist by the name of Nika Smith who I adore and respect so much. And she and I discovered that we are genetically related. She popped up on my mother's DNA match list as a cousin. And for about 2.5, almost 3 years, we have been looking for that connection. And I had identified a possible slaveholding family in my history where I thought that connection was. She actually discovered it using Freedmen's Bureau records and tribal enrollment records for, I believe it was the Cherokee in Oklahoma, and was able to discover that one of the descendants of one of my white ancestors married her ancestor, who was, well, they're both her ancestor, but I was related to this person, and they were married in Oklahoma in an interracial marriage in the 1870s, which was really surprising. But one of the things that I hear sometimes, and it's a little bit sad, is that sometimes someone will pop up on our DNA match list who doesn't look just like us, and we immediately dismiss it as if, well, we can't possibly be related to them. Well, you can. Just because I am 100% European does not mean that I can't have a person of color as a genetic cousin, because many of them are also mixed race, and so they are European, and usually that's where we're going to find that connection. So just be really sensitive to that. If somebody reaches out to you, maybe help provide them with some information, or use your DNA match list as an opportunity to start to make some of these connections. Now, what I've done is I've actually gone into my mother's match list, and we have proven now through genetics that Tobias Phillips is in fact the biological father of the 2 sons of Margaret Lawrence, because he had children with his legal wife, and his parents had other children, and we are genetically connected to descendants of the other children and the aunts and uncles. So there is a proven family connection there, and the amount of shared DNA and all of the information that we've been able to put together gives me a high degree of confidence that Tobias Phillips is in fact the father of the children of Margaret Lawrence. So now what I am looking for is, is there anybody in there who is related to Tobias Phillips' son George, who was given the instructions to use the Negro wench Fortimer until she had been delivered of 3 children. And my guess is what we're going to discover is descendants of those 3 children are genetically related to George, and thus to Tobias, and thus to us through the children of Margaret Lawrence. I hope you were able to follow that family tree in the air. I'm still trying to put the pieces together, so I don't have a family tree chart or something to show you on the screen, but as I'm putting all of this evidence together, I'm discovering a lot of really interesting things in the process. Okay, so there are some things that you need to remember in this process, and this is where I'll talk about where you can go to actually document information about them. I'm documenting it, right? I've transcribed the will. I've actually added Fortimer to my family tree, and I'll show you what I'm going to do with that here in just a minute. So one of the things you need to remember is just because someone has the same surname does not mean they are part of the same family. So if I come across somebody with the last name of Phillips living in Richmond, Virginia in the 1700s who is Black, that does not mean that that person is necessarily a descendant of Tobias and or George Phillips. Okay, they could be. It is a possible clue, and we need to kind of hold on to that. But this is where additional evidence becomes so much more important. Also, the reverse is also true, right? Just because somebody has a different name than the local family of white slaveholders, as you come across somebody, doesn't mean they're not related. Okay, again, they may have changed their name. They may not have wanted to be associated with the individual who was their slaveholder, and so they, upon emancipation, they may have chosen a name that has nothing to do with that family, even though they may be genetically part of that family. So keep that in mind. Another thing is, if you have proof of a familial relationship, add them to your tree. Okay, so here is, I'll show you what I've done, and then what I'm going to do to change it, and we'll walk through that. I wanted to do this as an example, so I've kind of left it the way it is here. So one of the things that we learned from the will of Tobias Phillips is that he had a Negro wench named Fortimer, and that he gave her to his son George. So I've entered Fortimer here in George's tree as a spouse. Now, I fully recognize she is not his spouse. If anything, this was a non-consensual relationship, okay, that produced offspring. But I want to make sure that the families are tied together, okay? Now, some subsequent research, I'm still trying to prove that she had these 3 children that were ascribed. There may have been more, actually, or less. But I still need to prove that. So for the time being, I need to sever this relationship until I can prove it. So one of the things you have to do in online trees is you add a relation. In order to put somebody in your tree who is kind of floating, you have to add them to someone. Okay, you can't just add a random person in a tree because they have to be connected to the tree somehow. But once they are connected to the tree, I can actually come in here and I can edit relationships, and I can now disconnect them. So I haven't proven yet that George Phillips and Fortimer, his Negro slave, had children together. And so I entered her, but now I need to disconnect them. And that allowed me to enter her, and I'll show you what I'll do to keep track of that here in just a minute. So now I'm going to X out of this relationship. So I'm going to cancel this relationship. So basically it's going to disconnect them, and now I will have George in the tree connected to the tree, and Fortimer will now be in my tree as kind of a floating entity until I figure out what her connection is specifically to this family. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to remove that relationship. Okay, so now she has no relationships in my tree for the time being. And it's going to refresh here. There we go. And now he does not show up here. So she's still in my tree, he's still in my tree, but they're not connected any longer. Okay, now what I'm going to do is I'm going to come find George Phillips in my tree. And what I do know is that his father willed her to him. So there is a connection. At one point, she was the property of Tobias, and then she becomes the property of George. So I want to make sure that I've got them connected and that she's not left floating out there in my tree, that she is connected to this family until I can prove that she's got children who are connected to this family. So under George here, I have the opportunity to add a web link. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to click add a web link. And then what I can put in here is the URL of the profile page for Fortimer. So I'm going to go back here and find Fortimer. And I'm going to go to her profile page. And then I'm going to copy the URL here of her profile page. And then I'm going to paste it here. And then under the link name, I'm going to write Fortimer. And Negro slave is the phrase that was used in Tobias's will, which is why I've reflected that here so that that then shows up. And now, rather than showing up as his spouse, which regardless of how you look at it, she was not, she is showing up here as a connected or a linked person, and I can just click that and it takes me directly to her profile. Now, of course, I do still have some more research to do, and if I discover that George did father children by Fortimer, I will add her back as a spouse. I'll change that relationship, and you can do that under Edit Relationships, and then list their children under there. Hopefully that all made sense, okay? But the idea is that if you have proof of a familial relationship, add them as family. If you do not have proof of a family relationship, add them to the tree, disconnect them from the individual, and then make a web link so that you can keep track of these enslaved individuals. We don't want to lose them. I think that just, for me, sorry, I get really emotional about this. For me, one of the reasons I do family history is because I don't want anybody to be forgotten. And these are people who have been forgotten for far too long. And so just saying their names, just acknowledging that they have a place in our family history, I think is important. And so that's why I have chosen to do this way. Another thing that you can do, and I would encourage you to do this, there's a group of bloggers who this just kind of grew out of something for Black History Month. And this February in the United States is Black History Month. And so this slave name roll project kind of grew out of that. They use a couple of hashtags. One is hashtag free the names. And you can, once you have documented a particular individual, you can submit them to the slave name roll project. Now, the easiest way to find that, of course, is to just Google slave name roll project. The Tangled Roots and Branches is the individual who is the name of the blog where these are showing up. And you can submit names, and you can also search the names. And you'll see here she has them broken out by state and then by county within that state. And there are links to records, wills, petitions, apprenticeship, indentureship records, all sorts of different records that document the names of these particular individuals. And so that's a great resource to search to see if anybody else has done any research on your particular slaveholding families. It's also a great resource to be able to submit to make that information more widely findable. It will be found probably if it is in your tree online, but it makes it more broadly findable and Google searchable to add it to this particular project. And so that's what I have chosen to do, is those two things. I'm documenting them in my tree as best I can, and then I'm also submitting to the Slave Name Roll Project so that those become readily searchable and findable. Well, that is all I have prepared for you today. I hope that this was useful. I would love to hear your suggestions for ways in which you are making these discoveries and ways in which you are documenting these discoveries in your own family tree. And let me just say again, I love making these connections. I love recognizing that even though Tobias Phillips may have been a horrible human being, because of him, I am connected to some pretty amazing people. There are some great opportunities for us to recognize our connections and to celebrate the goodness in spite of some of the horrible things that are in our history. And there's a lot I could say about that, but I'm pretty sure we're out of time. So if you have any comments, if you have any suggestions, please leave them in the comments here on the YouTube channel. I would love to continue this discussion, and hopefully sometime soon I will be able to do a follow-up video about what I discover about Fortimer and her children. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.